The high stakes are getting even higher in the legal drama between Donald Trump and special counsel Jack Smith. When Trump signaled that he would appeal a recent lower court ruling which held that he is not entitled to absolute presidential immunity for everything and anything said and done while in office, Jack Smith called his bluff and said, okay, if you're going to drag this out, let's just skip to the end. Let's ask the Supreme Court to get involved directly and address the specific matter. And almost immediately, the Supreme Court said they would grant expedited consideration as to whether or not they will hear this case. And right now, Trump, MAGA, and the right wing in general are panicked. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. All right, folks, got a clip or two to play here. This is big news because now the Supreme Court, the nation's highest court, is getting involved and the stakes are getting higher.
Breaking news, the Supreme Court just moments ago taking a step forward in a historic case involving Donald Trump. Late this afternoon, the Supreme Court agreeing to hear an extraordinary petition from special counsel Jack Smith, who is pursuing this criminal prosecution of Trump for his efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Now, the nation's highest court is now set to weigh in for the first time on the historic criminal prosecution of a former president. The special counsel is asking the justices to break from tradition and decide quickly on whether Donald Trump has immunity. Here is what the special counsel wrote in this petition. This case presents a fundamental question at the heart of our democracy, whether a former president is absolutely immune from federal prosecution for crimes committed while in office. Robert Costa is our chief election and campaign correspondent. He's here to help us understand these big developments. So, Robert, the special counsel is trying to make sure that his case moves forward on March 4th, right?
Nora, that's exactly right. Jack Smith is looking into the future. He knows when the January 6th trial begins next year, former President Trump will claim it's illegal and try to raise that with the highest court. That view is backed up by our sources who say Trump is pushing his lawyers to appeal, and argue he should be immune from prosecution about his alleged conduct while serving as president. But now Smith is trying to get ahead of Trump's strategy to make sure he's on solid ground legally and won't be delayed by a flurry of motions from Trump. Trump's team pushed back against him today, saying Smith is attempting to bypass the appeal process. They now have until December 20th to respond before the high court weighs in, if they do at all. All of this, of course, is going to take place as the Republican presidential race heats up next spring, and Trump could be wrapping up the nomination.
Also, in this petition, why did the special counsel reference U.S. versus Nixon?
Nor history hovers over everything, especially with this case. And remember, back in 1974, the U.S. government said President Richard Nixon couldn't protect his tapes. Now, the special counsel Jack Smith is looking for a similar ruling from the court to say prosecutors can move forward and try to prosecute a president or a former president.
So that's basically the gist of it. Trump's goal is to delay in the hopes that he can win the presidential election next year, and then he's entitled to at least 4 years of absolute presidential immunity because the Justice Department has a longstanding tradition. They will not prosecute a sitting president. That's his goal, is to run out the clock. Jack Smith knows it, so Jack Smith's trying to get ahead of it and have the Supreme Court weigh in. And yeah, they decided, the Supreme Court agrees to quickly decide whether or not it will review special counsel Jack Smith's petition on if Donald Trump has immunity from charges related to January 6th. This is the ruling. Petitioner's motion to expedite consideration of petition for writ of certiorari before judgment is granted, and respondent is directed to file a response to the petition on or before 4 p.m. on Wednesday, December 20th. So Trump has until December 20th, 4 p.m. to respond. And again, folks, this is huge, right? Now, they reference Nixon there at the end because, of course, the ethos which dictated Nixon's actions, this idea that he's above the law, that he even said famously, when the president does it, it's legal. It's the same ethos which guides Trump. He's hoping to say, listen, I'm basically a god. I'm above the law. Anything I say or do while I'm in office, no matter what, entitles me to absolute immunity. So you should kick this down the road. We'll come back to that in a moment. But then, of course, the question becomes, okay, if Smith is calling Trump's bluff, is there a risk here? And most consensus I read said, actually, this is it's a bold move. It's unconventional, but not unprecedented by Smith. But of course, there is a risk.
Paula said that she doesn't think that a ruling on this case would necessarily impact any of the other criminal cases Trump is facing. Do you agree?
So I agree with Paula 99% of the time. I slightly disagree on this one. If Donald Trump is to win here, Obviously, Jack Smith's federal election interference case is out the window. I also think Fani Willis's case is doomed. Yes, that is a state-level case, but the principles of immunity would apply whether it's a federal or state-level prosecution. Again, that's if Trump wins. I do agree with Paula. This will have no impact on the hush money case because that conduct almost entirely happened before Trump was president, and it definitely will not impact the federal Mar-a-Lago classified documents case because that conduct was entirely after Donald Trump was president. But if he wins here, I think 2 of the 4 cases are going to be out the window.
So there is a risk there, right? And you might be thinking, well, it's not looking good because we have a 6-3 conservative supermajority. 3 of that 6 were appointed by Trump himself. So there is a risk that this goes the opposite way. So as far as the claims of Trump's immunity and the implications of it, and again, we'll go back to the composition of the court in a minute, but this is what I find interesting. As a practical matter, DOJ has pointed out that the implications of Trump's position, that he has absolute immunity, would grant absolute immunity from criminal prosecution to a president who accepts a bribe in exchange for a lucrative government contract for a family member, a president who instructs his FBI director to plant incriminating evidence on a political enemy, a president who orders the National Guard to murder his most prominent critics, or a president who sells nuclear secrets to a foreign adversary. That can't be right. So at least on the merits, it seems pretty obvious that Trump is not entitled to absolute presidential immunity for anything he says and done while he's in office. It has to be related to explicit official duties. And trying to overturn an election you lost is not an official duty of a sitting president, Republican or Democrat, Trump or Biden, okay? But what's so scary in all this is that if you look at Twitter, I mean, they're freaking out right now that the Supreme Court agreed to hear this. Julie Kelly is one right-wing commentator I was following. Her reaction was hilarious because when it was first announced that Jack Smith was going to, appeal for an expedited consideration, she was very cocky. She was like, he's so desperate he has to go to the Supreme Court. She was very confident that the court wouldn't grant it. And then the court did almost immediately. And then she started to panic. And this is very common. Of course, it's also sad the opposite reaction, which is there are so many Trump cultists out there who genuinely believe that Trump is above the law and should be above the law, and that a president can literally say or do whatever they want when they're in office and not be punished for it after, as long as it's Trump or a Republican. You can bet your you-know-what that if it were Obama or Biden or a President Clinton, they would have the opposite view. They would say, of course, it's anti-American to believe that a president is entitled to absolute, godlike monarchical immunity. But the standards change for the right when it comes to Trump and Republicans. Now, then, of course, you consider the Supreme Court as well. We talked about how there's a 6-3 conservative supermajority. Well, one of the justices is Clarence Thomas, arguably the most corrupt of all of them. There's an argument to be made that he should recuse himself from this case if the Supreme Court decides to weigh in, because it involves Trump's attempts to overturn the 2020 election and his involvement with the January 6th insurrection. And we have pretty credible evidence that Clarence Thomas's wife, Ginny Thomas, was involved, that she was texting Donald Trump's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, about efforts to overturn the result of the election. And the Supreme Court recently unveiled that that binding code of ethics, right? That they said, hey, listen, we're taking this seriously now. We want you to know we believe in ethics. We believe in recusal rules. So as former Bill Clinton Labor Secretary Robert Reich points out, reminder that Ginny Thomas was directly involved in the plot to overturn the 2020 election. If the new Supreme Court code of ethics was worth anything, Clarence Thomas would be forced to recuse himself from weighing in on this decision. Hello? Will he? Probably not, but maybe. I mean, on the one hand, he didn't recuse himself from a major Supreme Court decision regarding getting evidence on January 6th insurrectionists and participants, even though most career ethicists said he should have recused himself. But then on the other hand, earlier this year, he did recuse himself from another January 6th related case once the pressure was on. So he's got a mixed record when it comes to this. But folks, this is a big deal. Again, I want to stress, this doesn't mean that the Supreme Court is going to hear the case. They could punt. They could decide not to take up the case. Or they could take up the case and decide the wrong way. But there's a possibility that they hear this case and they decide that, you know what, Republican, Democrat, guy who appointed us, different guy, nobody's entitled to absolute immunity for literally everything they do. We grant certain special considerations to sitting presidents, but Donald Trump isn't the sitting president, and therefore he's not above the law. That's the hope. But regardless, it is good news that the Supreme Court seems to be indicating that, yeah, we see that there's a public interest here. So whereas normally things could linger for months and months and months, no, we're going to expedite the decision as to whether or not we will or will not hear this case. So seems like a silver lining. Let me know what you think in the comments.